as many of you are aware, it was World Suicide Prevention Day on Friday last week. And within that, the theme for World Suicide Prevention of 2021 was creating hope through action. And so within that, I'm going to take a few minutes to read through the words. I won't read through them for you. But within that, that's very much present in every day, really, within those we work with and for in the service. Hope is an enormously important part of the work we do, both for ourselves and obviously with friends and family and our community. So we very much hold and act on the creation of hope day to day. So a little bit about the service. We are a free and confidential service. We're contracted by the local authority. The area that we support is Camden, Islington, Barnet, Enfield and Haringey. We also support individuals who live outside of the 5 boroughs, but may have been impacted by a loss that occurred within the boroughs. And as such, we've supported people as far wide as France, Turkey, America. So the reach can be very wide. And there's no upper or lower age limits, so we support both young people and adults. Where we do support young people, we do try and work with services such as CAMS as much as possible, obviously due to the vulnerabilities factors and the sensitivities of working with young people. But there is no upper or lower age range. Our core opening hours are Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And we also provide support up to 8 p.m. in the evening for individuals that have returned back to work. So making it sort of easier and most accessible for you is priority for us. And again, through whichever means you feel most comfortable. So we still use a blended approach at the service. We use phone, video, face-to-face, really whichever means is easiest and most accessible to you, and will be guided and led through you as to what you choose and what you decide you'd like that to look like. We support people at any stage of bereavement, so we do support individuals literally, it can at times be hours after a loss of a loved one. And again, indeed, we supported a lady recently, and she lost her mother 25 years ago. So again, it's at any length that loss. Here's our service leaflet, just so you can have a look. It's got the information on there, contact numbers, website address. And again, if you go onto the website address there, you will find a referral form, further information about the service and how to refer in. If you experience any difficulties using or accessing the referral forms, anybody is welcome to contact us by phone as well, or email, and we could go through that on the phone with you. And here's the referral form, just so you can see what that looks like. It's not too exhaustive, but there's some sensitive information that we try and collate on there, but it's entirely through your choice whether you share that information with us or not. And then this is a little bit of information of the lived experience feedback so far from clients that have accessed the service. So within that, I think that's a great time for me to introduce Leona again. Leona supports with the group facilitation. And so Leona, you work very closely with a lot of the individuals that we work with. And so you could probably touch on some of the experience of the feedback you've received thus far.
Yes, I've been with the group now for, I think this is our 6th week, this week will be our 7th. And since joining the group, it's been a great help to me, as well as I think to the others in the group. We've been able to laugh, cry, share with each other without judgment. And it's a great support, I think, for each member of the group. Everyone takes something from each session that we've did. and sharing experiences with each other is helping us along our healing journey, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's been, I think everybody who's attending the groups, we look forward to every week. It's part of our joy in the week, isn't it? It
is like a camaraderie that we have there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the occasional piece of cake.
Yes.
Okay, so Liv, perhaps this would be a good time for you to come in and we can talk a little bit more about suicide and some of the stigma associated with that.
Thank you. And on Leona's comments, just speaking about the lived experiences, we have a very unique space offering support for people who are bereaved by suicide. I think the lived experience is very difficult to share, even though it is so widespread and so very well experienced within our different communities. So going through lived experience, I think one thing that I resonated with in working through the service, and I do bereavement and emotional support, which I suppose is code for just being a fairy and trying to find ways to support people in whichever way it is that they need. But we are contracted through the local authorities, as Naomi mentioned, as well as being able to contact people immediately after a suicide. So we speak with the police, they give us confidential information, and we make initial contact after there has been a death. And I think why this is so pertinent is with death, there is a lot of psychological inertia, so people aren't really sure how to navigate and what to do with pamphlets and leaflets. Their whole world has been turned upside down, and it's really difficult to make sense of what services to access. So we become a very helpful segue into identifying what a person might need and signposting them to sister organizations or just absorbing them into the services, just like ours. And I think the facts about suicide, we have probably spoken about this over and over and over again, but it doesn't stop being any less sobering. One of the things that really resonated with me, and I know all of you can read and are probably familiar with some aspects of suicide, but there is this stigma and as well as this false belief that 6 people are affected by every death by suicide. On average, through more recent research, we have found that it's over 135 people. And with social media and in the pandemic, that has extended to over 200 people, where one person dies by suicide and there's an absolute ripple effect of people that are affected by that and really having to navigate the loss. If we look at the fact that one person dies by suicide every 40 seconds, by the time I finish the sentence, we would have lost somebody else. So this is happening in our community. It is more rampant than what COVID is. It is more insidious than the HIV virus as well as malaria. And men are still at an incredibly vulnerable space within this mental health and probably community health issue as well. But if you go to the next slide, thank you. There's still the big S around suicide. The people like to think about the stigma, but there's also an incredible amount of shame, and shame happens in 2 boats. It's the shame of losing somebody to suicide and feeling like you should have done something, should have known something. But it's also shame about having suicidal thoughts and how incredibly isolating that is. And in a lot of research that has been done quite recently, probably from 2018 upwards, shame is one of the most deadly emotions that a person can experience. So there's a lot of stigma around losing somebody to suicide. But even having those thoughts in of itself can be quite stigmatizing. When I first learned about the shame around suicide and grief, I was in my infancy of doing training, both therapeutically and within the service. And I was probably about 20. And we were working through, and we all got a whole lot of cases allocated to us. And one of them was a death by suicide. And the psychologist at the time looked at our supervisor and said, "What do I say when I phone them?" And that shows you how incredible grief is and how it leaves us without any opportunity to say anything. And this inertia and awkwardness, I guess, around grief. Losing somebody to suicide is probably one of the most lonely difficult, traumatic, and hard processes to navigate, which is why emotional support is so helpful, because you have somebody who can be your auxiliary brain while you're navigating through all of the grief. Language matters. This is something that we speak about over and over again. We are at a space where suicide used to be a crime, so people committed suicide. Even in an inquest process, if you are registered, you become a person of interest, which feels like there's some onus of blame. So we come from a space where we don't want people to feel stigmatized by, but we're still saying words like commit and person of interest, and really thinking about, oh, what did you do wrong, or what was wrong with them? That is very much in the dynamics of our language. Even if people aren't coping well, we say, we just think that they've gone a bit mad. So in the way that we speak to one another and in the way that we try and package things, I think suicide and the insensitivities around that are very much pronounced. We hear quite a lot of suicidal ideation and even suicide attempts as being attention seeking. If the only thing that you can remember from this presentation is that it's attention needing, it's a human being with a giant red flag saying, I need support, then I think that we all here have done our job. And there is an incredible amount of difficulty when we're talking to somebody who is in the grieving process. All you need to do is just to be with them, to not feel like they have leprosy, that there's something wrong. We're trying to help people navigate an absolute paradigm shift within their life. And I think for me, the pain of suicide is a systemic and cultural issue. When we lose somebody to suicide, we are left with a multitude of questions and hardly any answers. It can be very difficult to step into the mindset of somebody who goes to the point where they feel that taking their life is the only option. And there are a lot of myths. There is a lot of stigma, again, which seems to come from that. But it's an individual who is absolutely exhausted. They cannot see any other way out. And each individual experience is very unique. So I don't like to stereotype, but the individual who gets to the point where they really are thinking about suicide aren't really able to think about different alternatives. It's not somebody that's doing it to be malicious. It's not somebody who is weak. It is an individual who is so incredibly tired of having to be as strong as what they've had to be for however long it is. And it is an overbearing, insidious mental pain that just seems to go on and on. But there's also the pain of burden on the people left behind. And that is why I feel prevention and being at a preventative measure, not just to create culture where we talk about suicide, but also where people feel hopeless, that they think that there's a place to go, that they're seen, that they're recognized, would be absolutely incremental. Because if we lose a person every 40 seconds, and about 200 people are affected by that death, we can imagine what statistics we are starting to accumulate together. And one of the things I really want to end on is the fact that hindsight is 2020. I think in suicide attempt survivors, suicide survivors who have lost people to suicide and mental health, we put a lot of onus of responsibility on our shoulders. When we look back, I think hindsight for me is a very cruel teacher, and it makes us feel like there's all these kind of things that we could have done. There's a psychological term for this actually called the golden bias, where we look back in the future and think about all the things that we should have done, and we look towards the past and we're not really able to navigate where one thing ends and where another thing begins. So if you are going through a bereavement by suicide, just know that the what ifs and if onlys, those need to be parked. And instead of going through that cycle over and over again, you can do a little bit of a paradigm shift and think, okay, what did I do? What have I done? Rather than magnifying a really painful experience within your loved one's life. I also think that it's incredibly important to have boundaries when it comes to communicating with friends and family. When you're having to re-explain things over and over, it can be quite a daunting thing. So send a generic WhatsApp text and help people understand what it is you need with your grief. Navigate and narrate it as well. And if you are looking for emotional support and you don't find a good fit, I use a very crude analogy where emotional support and therapy is almost like Tinder. You have to go through all the different things to make sure that you find a person that you're comfortable with. And you are allowed to fire your therapist, you're allowed to fire your emotional support worker if you are bereaved by suicide or struggling with suicidal ideation. And you are completely within your rights to say, I acknowledge that you feel empathy for me, but I'm not ready to go there yet. Okay, that's it. I'll tag team Lisa. Boop, boop.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk about the common emotions that we might feel, and Liv has covered some of that. And I want to start with the shock, because shock in any bereavement happens. You know, you can be sat by someone's bedside, walk out the door and say, I can't believe they've gone. With suicide, I've seen that people can stay shocked for weeks, months, sometimes years, in that state of shock and disbelief that it's actually happened. And it's okay to accept that shock in the first instance, it is. Once you start talking about it, that shock will wear off. It wears off at different times for different people. I also think it's kind of a comfort blanket shock. It sort of gives you your mind time to catch up with the trauma, because some people not only experience a suicide by bereavement, but they actually discover their loved one. And that shock is a trauma. And any trauma takes a time to come to terms with. So shock and trauma are very interlinked in this bereavement. Liv has talked about the shame. There is a lot of shame. It comes from cultural elements, it comes from religious elements. It's hard for me to understand why there is so much shame around this bereavement. The only shame I feel is it's a shame that that person couldn't have reached out, that person couldn't have got help. That's the shame really for me. But some people feel so stigmatized by this bereavement that it prevents them from actually seeking support and moving forward with any degree of hope if they stay in the shame. Disbelief and shock, they're one in the same. It's like, it is historically known as the why death suicide, and there is lots of whys, but I think it's really as well, how? That's also the disbelief. How can someone do this? How can someone get to that point to be able to switch off their survival instinct, which is, you know, so strong in all of us, that we're questioning, like, how can you get to that point when that person has taken their life and you're supporting that person following that bereavement? It really does sink in how bad you can feel to be at that point that you want to take your life, that you want to end what you're feeling. There's so much confusion around all of it. You're flooded, completely flooded. It's like your life changes overnight. And it's the confusion is also interlinked with the stigma, the fear, the guilt, everything. Confusion is all these things rolled into one word. Anger. Now, a lot of people, from the people that I've helped on this service, I've rarely come across someone that's angry. But what do you do if you are angry? Do you feel even more shame because you're actually angry at the person for taking their life? Anger is a natural reaction in grief, and it might not even be, there's a confusion about the anger as well. So all these words interlink. The fear of how people are going to look at you in the future, the fear of having to find a way forward in the future. There's all of these feelings come out, and they can persist, and they will persist for years if you don't talk about it. You must have a place where you can talk with no judgment on you, where, like, I think Leona will agree, in our groups, the group that I'm running with Leona, it's focused on a parent's loss of a child. And the fact that the people that have come to the group, the one thing I think they've taken away from the group is they are no longer feeling alone and isolated. Like this has happened to me, just me, and this is my fault. There is nobody to blame. Certainly not the person that's taken their life, and certainly not the people that are left behind. There is no blame. There is only a way forward, that we have to find solutions to prevent some deaths from happening. Now, Olivia talked about the shame surrounding suicide and how it affects us all. And it does. We can't get caught up in the whys, the ifs, the ands, the buts, the maybes. But I've noticed that people need to do that process. And when you're working with a support worker, I often do the logical stuff, which is what I bring to my support. Is it logical to blame yourself in hindsight? Is there more you could have done? If at that moment you knew, you would have acted. So trying to give yourself a break is very, very, very important when you're trying to grieve someone from suicide. Trying to understand them. What you're doing in that process of grief is trying to make sense of the whole situation. Where, what could I have done more? Where would I have been? All these things. And it's a process, and it's part of the process. But at some point, like Olivia says, you have to stop asking these questions and allow the healing to begin. Is there a next slide attached, Naomi? So these are all the symptoms or presentations you're going to get around, and many more that's probably not even listed there. So irritability. I mean, I can totally understand irritability and grief, because you're flooded. It becomes your whole life, grief, especially a traumatic, complicated grief such as suicide. You might have poor sleep, definitely heightened anxiety. You can suffer physical pain, headache, stomachache, the negative internal dialogue goes back to the hindsight, constantly beating yourself up. Illnesses, definitely, I've worked with more than one person that's developed ulcers, abscesses, which is all about anger, really. You can feel detached. It's like, if you don't know anybody else that's experienced this, you can feel, this is me on my own. Where am I to blame? And if you are grieving in a different grieving style to some members of your family or your friendship groups, that can cause heightened detachment and feeling that there's something wrong with you. I'm not crying enough, I'm crying too much. All of these things here you can experience, and huge amounts more. It can mask a lot of stuff, because when you're grieving, it can physically feel like you're in pain. I mean, it really just, and it masks so many other things. So self-care is really, really important. But how do you give yourself self-care when you're really not in the right headspace, if you're in that blaming? The one thing I would say that I will tackle with people, and in my hardest of cases, is to tackle the blame. Let's stop blaming, because if you feel it's fair to blame yourself, then you have to blame the person that's taken their life, and that is not fair either. So it's about being logical in this bereavement, and the one way you can get logic is to reach out for support. There is a magic in being able to talk about your grief in a way that you're not judged, and it releases something, and it is a process. Always remember this, it is a process. And if you are feeling bad and desperate and heartbroken following the bereavement by suicide, it is down to one thing. It's because you've lost somebody you loved. And that is, you know, grief is love. It's the flip side. And there's you can find positive ways, but they come. But you must all give yourself a chance to experience the light coming back into your life and not feel guilty. A few slides ago, we talked about guilt. This is also relevant when you're trying to heal. I should never laugh again. I shouldn't have a good life again. I hate the word should, because there's no mileage to the word should. I should have got the 6 numbers for the lottery, but I didn't. You know, that's the kind of shoulds I'm talking about. Support is paramount. You can get through anything with support, but you have to be able, you have to come. And another thing about grief is, if you can come from a point of view where you will never let it define you, you've got that in you, you are halfway there. And with support, you can get the whole way there. You can never accept this, but you can come to terms with it and live with it in a better way than it feels like at the moment in the early stages of bereavement. And even when you try and tell someone that, if you go back to Leona, she will tell you there is life after bereavement of suicide, but it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes faith. Self-care. Sorry,
Lisa. Yeah, I was just going to say, with the groups, when I first went to the group and I saw the stages, different stages that people were at in their grief, I can see how far I've come within the 6 years.
yeah.
That's given me a lot of hope as well.
Visuals are great, aren't they? Because you
most
need to see it. Anyone can tell you this, but seeing it with your own eyes and you get it internalized, you can see there is hope. And that leads on, all this leads on to self-care. Self-care is like, the last thing you're going to want to do is self-care when you're that down, when you're blaming yourself and you think your world has ended. But it is very important to keep your physical health up so that you can keep your mental health up. You know, one leads into the other. And working with people like anyone on our team, we'll try to equip you with a toolkit so that you can find ways forward, so that you can see hope coming back, even in a pinprick of light. That's enough for that to grow. Some people enjoy walks, gardening, outdoor exercise. They're all really good for your mental health. Whatever it is that you can find that's a healthy distraction, allow it. Give yourself permission to have that, because your grief will be a process that you work through, but you need a small amount of time, if you can, to just be distracted, to give yourself a breathing space in grief, because it's long, especially in this bereavement. It is very, very long, but it will end. It will end. Is there another slide there, Naomi? Identifying your support network. We can help you do that. If you can't identify it yourself, we can look at ways of you. Grieving alone is going to be one of the worst case scenarios you could ever imagine. So having people to talk it over with, people that won't judge you, people that can listen to you, GPs that can signpost you, we can signpost you, friends, you know, family members, you know, being able to say to somebody within a family unit, this is how I feel today, without the fear of triggering them. It can just sometimes be a fear of your own. Everybody wants to speak, even when people are so desperate that they are considering or actually complete suicide. They all want to say it, but they can't. There's something that prevents people from saying, I feel this bad. And it is okay to say, I feel this bad. Don't let things go round and round in your head. Share it. And someone will be able You never ever know who is going to be able to give you a light bulb moment when you're feeling at your worst, if you give them the chance. And these are all really, really good ways of reaching out for support. You can do, I mean, obviously we all know about the Samaritans and the great work they do. The Listening Place, Calm, Papyrus, had an opportunity to meet somebody from Papyrus recently, a really well thought out service. And that's, you know, that's nationwide, and they're increasing their core hours all the time. SOBS, brilliant. The only difference on this service that we have made between us and SOBS is that our groups are focused. So anyone that is bereaved in the group that we're running currently as a parent, we plan to do a siblings group, a first responders group, a friends and family group, anything that is focused so that people can understand they are not alone. Any of these services are there to help. Reach out. And if you don't find the right one the first time, like Olivia says, reach out again, because there is someone on the end of a phone or on a screen or face to face. Just give yourself that chance. It's a chance that you need to give yourself. And if you're lucky enough, your employer will have EAP. Use it. It's there to be used, and people are there at the end of a line.